Well, it's a great privilege and pleasure to have a chance to talk to Sir John Gurdon. May I call you John? Is that? John, where and when were you born?
Right, I was born in 1933. Is the sound okay? Or,
yes, that's fine.
Yes. Yep. In the southern counties. The background, in case it's relevant, is that our family actually goes back a very long way, reliably to 1199, as a matter of fact.
Gosh.
So we have a lineage, and the family was rather well established in Suffolk, in a big house for a few hundred years.
Whereabouts in Suffolk?
That was in a place called Assington, sort of in the Sudbury area. Rather splendid house, very large. But my grandfather, who'd inherited from a few generations back, ran out of money because he really survived by renting out farming land, and the repeal of the Corn Laws meant that the farmers couldn't sell that produce, and so they couldn't pay rent, and my grandfather finally had to sell up in 1894 completely the family home, and he then took over the two sons, which was my father and my uncle, and my father then worked in India and Burma for a while, and then in due course his father, my grandfather, said to him, "Will you? I would like you to get married and continue the family, so I will personally pay you a pension." By this time the grandfather had made some money. If you would agree to come back and find a wife and make a family, and so that's what happened. And I was then born when my father had left India, and was brought up in the sort of Surrey-Hampshire border, and so that's how I came into existence. But the family does go back a long way, and actually there's no evidence of any scientific inclination or interest in the family. They're mostly politicians and that kind of thing as they go back.
Tell me something about your father's personality. What sort of person was he?
Right, he was quite retiring in a way, my grandfather even more so, but he was very meticulous, and in his later years he read an enormous amount, absorbed everything he could by reading, and became very good at financial matters, which really re-established the family in a relatively comfortable financial state, because he'd inherited almost nothing. And he then, my mother encouraged him to do something when he'd retired from India, so he then took up Braille transcription to transcribe exceedingly heavy-going legal textbooks into Braille for the blind as a voluntary thing to do. But they used to ask him to do that because he was so careful at doing it, and so that was a major interest of his. He'd had a rather distinguished war period when he was awarded a DCM for gallantry in the First World War, that was. And then in the Second World War he was just over age, so he was the air raid chief warden for the village. So he took part in village activities and quite a lot of voluntary work. Both my parents did a lot of that.
But there was no scientific interest particularly on his part?
No, none really at all.
And your mother? What was she like?
She was born of a Yorkshire farming family, and was a very go-ahead person who, at an unusual time, decided to take a school-teaching job in America. Went out there and taught in the school, and then she came back and became married to my father, and then she was always very energetic. She used to run anything that could be run locally, the sort of local activities and the Women Institute and that sort of thing, and was a wonderful person, extremely supportive of anything, you might say. So when I took an interest in insects, which I did at an early age, she would sort of encourage that. But then I had by that time my parents had enough money to send me to a private school called Eton, where I was.
Eton?
Eton, yes. And,
You say called Eton, yes.
Well, that's where it was. I did one term of science, age 15, and I still am amused by the report that the schoolmaster wrote at that point, and I have it actually sitting in my office here, but it said something like, "Gurdon is the worst pupil it has been my lot to teach." And he said, "I have heard there is some talk about Gurdon wanting to be a scientist. This would be a complete, total waste of time, both from his point of view and those whose job it would be to teach him." And so I was immediately told, "Well, you're not a scientist, we'll get you off that." So that was the end of my scientific career at school, after which I was put on to Greek and Latin, which was quite interesting. But my real interest had always been in insects and that sort of thing.
How early was this insect interest? How early was your interest in insects?
Oh, probably from age about 8 onwards. I had an aunt who used to catch me butterflies, and I liked to set them and find out what they were. And then for my leisure reading, when I was in sort of mid-teens, I bought one of these very heavy textbooks of entomology, which I used to enjoy reading and reading about it. And so my kind mother decided that I really was a scientist at heart rather than a classicist, and so she arranged through family connections to get an interview with the professor of zoology in Oxford, of course Alistair Hardy, and somehow persuaded him that I should be allowed to switch from classics to zoology if I did an intervening year in a sort of crammers to get through the sort of O-level science. And it was a risk because I might not have taken to the subject, but at any rate, they having paid my school fees, they then ended up having to pay another year of private tuition in biology and science, elementary science, to be allowed to start at Oxford. And that was again a piece of luck, because the admissions tutor for the college I went to, called Christ Church, was a man called Trevor Roper.
Hugh, yes, I knew him, yes.
But he had more important things on his mind, and I remember getting a letter one September saying that they'd considered my application to go to Christ Church, and very pleased to tell me that they could accept me on 2 conditions. One was that I came into residence almost immediately, in 2 weeks' time, and the second was that I did not read the subject in which I had taken the entrance. Later I got to know him personally quite well, because I was a fellow of Christ Church, and he said that was embarrassing. He just had got the numbers wrong and suddenly found there were shorter places, so anyone who'd applied and they hadn't done much about it, they then got hold of. And so I got in through an enormously backdoor arrangement, which would never have been possible at the present time. So I was very, very fortunate, and really thanks to one's parents for seeing what one's interests really were, and allowing one to sort of recover from a really bad teacher at school.
Can I just go back quite a bit, because I wondered what preparatory school you'd gone to before Eton.
Yes, that was one in the village called, the first one I went to was a curious school called Frensham Heights. It was co-educational, and I remember then that they, age 8, they did an intelligence test, and I still remember it, where they said, draw an orange. So I started with a pen and thinking the orange wouldn't be there if it weren't hanging on something, so I drew the stalk. The woman said, across the road said, "Stupid boy, stupid boy." I said, "Draw an orange." So I said, and I never got much further than that, and what she meant was draw a circle. But anyway, my parents then got a message from the school saying that there were really, really great difficulties, and I think I would need special education, because I wasn't able to take a normal education, at which point they changed me to another school, which I must say was an excellent school in the same village called Edgeborough, a small private school, where there were very nice masters and staff, and they sort of survived that quite well.
Which village was this?
This was called Frensham Farnham in Surrey. Surrey.
Yeah. And were there any teachers in that first school who you remember or had any influence on you?
No, not at the first school. The second school I remember them very well.
Or the
became
second?
personal friends, because they lived in the village and we knew them personally.
You still remember who they were? Or?
Sorry.
Do you remember their names?
Oh
or?
yes, yes. The headmaster was Charles Mitchell. The deputy headmaster was Bob Hardy, and the Latin master was Norman Stone. And I remember all of them. And we lived in the village. As career went on, we sort of got to know them socially. Very nice people. Lovely school.
So that took you through to Eton, didn't it?
Yes, that did. Yes.
Apart from insects, did you have any other hobbies or particular interests? Sport
during my Eton time, I became very keen on in particular squash as a game, partly because you could play it whenever you wanted, and I took to that. So my ambition was to end up doing well. I did actually end up being captain of the school team. After a lot of effort. I mean, it was an enormous amount of practice, but I was keen to do that. So I achieved that particular objective there, and I was a keen skier. So I got into the second university team for skiing. But again, I didn't really feel I had any great ability. It was just sort of hard work and practice that sort of got one to a reasonable level. So my main interest at school was squash as a sport, skiing in the holidays, and I became schoolboy secretary of the Natural History Society, which sort of got me into science a bit more. But those were my main.
What about music?
No, I was never either very keen or remotely suited for it.
But do you like it, or you do listen to it?
Only a little bit. I don't go to, not very arty, I don't go to theatres and spend much time watching other people or listening to other people performing their activities.
Do you have, by the way, brothers or sisters?
Yes, I have a sister, yes.
Younger? Or?
She's younger, just younger than me.
What does she do?
She became a nurse, and then she married a farmer who has a very big estate in Lincolnshire, and so they live out there, and I keep up with her very well. Been a sort of, well, of course, lifetime friend, you might say.
So when you got to Christchurch and you were told you could do anything except what you'd applied to do, that left it rather open to you. What did you decide you'd do?
Well, the idea was to do zoology because I got this interest in insects, and so I went to the crammer, and they said you had to pass the so-called prelim exams in 1 year, and that was tough. So I started getting rid of chemistry, which was really just learning formulae after one term. Then physics was very elementary, and then that left the biology for the summer term, and thank heavens got through those 3 tests, which then meant I was able to start as an undergraduate after 1 year. So I had, of course, to be given 4 years, not 3, but as they were short of customers, that was possible.
So you started in your second year to read zoology?
Yes.
Proper?
Yes.
Who were they? I think you mentioned Hardy, Alistair
Hardy was a wonderful man. He was the head of department, and again, actually became a personal friend. Knew him very well. And it was a remarkable department. Among the eminent people there was a man called Tinbergen.
Oh yes, Nico Tinbergen.
Got a Nobel Prize for animal behaviour. Remarkable.
What sort of man was he?
He was a very pleasant gentleman. We sort of knew him, or a small department, you knew all these people well. So it was rather a boring course, to be frank. So 3 days of the week we did the animal kingdom. And
the whole of the animal kingdom?
The whole of the animal kingdom, just solidly through it, including paleontology. I mean, it must have been the last year you spent 3 days a week doing paleontology, which was describing bones that had been dug up from somewhere. Romans, paleontology, you had to learn every bone. It's really a sort of non-intellectual exercise, just memory thing. So when the time came to, well, I was lucky. I was doing badly as a student, and then I thought there's no way I'm going to get through this exam. So something persuaded me that the only thing to do was to look at all the old exam papers for the last 10 years, which I did, and then classified all the questions, and then would go to each staff member and say, how would you expect me to answer this question? And because I'd noticed that the questions were somewhat similar each year. So that, by an amazing piece of luck, got me a good degree, which meant I was able to be a PhD student. And because of my interests in insects, I'd gone to the entomology department, Hope department, which is part of zoology. And very fortunately, the professor rejected me as a PhD student. I'd asked if I could become one, but thank heavens he said no. Bad record. And then this wonderful man, Michael Fishberg, was the embryology teacher, and I warmed to him, and he then actually offered me a place, believe it or not, in his group to do embryology as a PhD student. So I welcomed that, I must say. And that was probably one of the most important steps in one's career, because he was an extremely wonderful person, and put me on to a rather dull project which I didn't thrive on for 3 months. And he said, well, you might as well try this new thing that's just come out in journals called nuclear transfer. So tried that, and by an amazing piece of luck it looked like it was working. So he then sort of gave me that as a major project, and was immensely supportive. I mean, he would let me do anything I wanted, just try anything you want, and if it works, good luck to you. And so that was an amazing piece of luck. So several times I sort of survived what the sort of fate that should really have overtaken me, like becoming a sort of museum entomologist or something like that, and or not getting into university at all. And it was an amazing piece of luck, but somehow it worked out. And then thanks to my supervisor, Michael Fishberg, then things took off once experiments start to work. You really don't have a problem. So
can we just go back to the undergraduate time a little more? Were there any of your friends or age mates who you still remember or influence you?
One who I kept up with all my life and still do, then called Brian Klug, became Professor of Genetics in Nottingham and Fellow of the Royal Society and so on. So he's done very well, and we're sort of personal friends of his. One other person, the best person in the class, became Professor of Biology in York, or John Curry, and I keep up marginally with him, but really with Brian Clark, who was a co-PhD student. We used to, there were only about 3 or 4 of us in that year, so we used to go out most evenings and have a snack somewhere or other. So it was
very small.
very small.
Yes. Were there other things you were doing at university? Did you do any sport or drama or anything?
I tried to. I went into squash thinking it would be a sensible thing to do, and it was, except that I don't have the physique to really excel. So I got into the second university team quite well and was tested for the first team, the Blues, but I never really had the stamina to, at that level, to keep this relentless running. And then when I had 1 year to go, it was either a matter of saying, well, I'll really concentrate hard on getting a blue for squash, or give that up and try and get my work going. So I decided to do the work side, the science side, and luckily that paid off. And then I was in the second university ski team, which so sport was interesting to me without doubt. But I didn't do music or drama or those sorts of things.
What about politics?
No, I didn't really take any interest in that.
Have you ever since?
Not significantly. I mean, one has one's views, but I don't spend time on that at all.
How would you describe yourself politically?
In terms of politics?
Yes.
Well, I suppose everyone calls themselves middle of the road, and I think I probably am. So I'm sort of left of Conservative and right of Labour, somewhere in the middle, and I find myself leaning slightly to one or slightly to the other according to what they're doing. But I suppose in principle I'm rather a...
liberal?
Sorry?
Would you describe yourself as a...
I might say hardliner. The sort of thing I very strongly object to is people who don't do any work and just say the state must support me for doing nothing. I feel that's completely wrong, and that people should not be able to be just mollycoddled by the state because they don't feel like doing a job, and people who do a job earn the money, pay taxes and pay for them. So I feel strongly on that kind of front. But that's not really political so much as, I don't know what you call it, but it's a view. Sort of respect for people who really put a lot into their life and contribute, as opposed to those who don't.
And the other thing that often, certainly at school or university, is important to people is religion.
Yes.
Was your family or you?
Yes, we used to be. My father would take us to church, line us up to go to our family to church every Sunday in the morning, and very routine procedure. I support the church. I'm in terms of religious views, I would say I'm actually an agnostic on the grounds of I don't know. There's no scientific proof of one thing or another, so I take that view. But I support the sort of ethics of the Church of England. I'm pretty pretty strongly anti-Roman Catholic. You can imagine with my field, I disagree strongly with what they do, and think that it's completely improper for them to lay down the law. People should decide what they think themselves.
In particular in relation to reproductive technologies?
Yes, so this idea of anti-contraceptive, completely nonsensical to me, and anti-stem cells, another thing. In fact, moving on as it were, I find myself giving sort of lectures or a bit more to theology students from time to time. Now, this happened because in my college days, I thought the sermons were boring. They would say, we'll take, Corinthians 2 verse such and such, what it meant, right? I didn't see that was very interesting. So I then said to the chaplain, why don't you ask fellows occasionally to give an address or something of anything they like to talk about? And there was no, the letter was not responded to for a year, when we then acquired back the Bishop of Coventry, who had been a previous fellow of the college.
Is this at Christ Church or Magdalen?
This is Magdalen, I'm sorry, this is
yeah.
Magdalen, Cambridge. This was, he came, Simon Barrington Ward, and so I mentioned it to him, and he said, oh, well, we must do something about that. So then I was asked to, got a letter in due course saying, well, would you actually happen to like to give an address in chapel? So I chose to do that, and this was, I took as a theme that you should not be prevented from trying to relieve human suffering by your religious views. Rather sort of controversial. But I said, you don't have to believe what I say, just think about it. And the chaplain didn't really like it at all.
Were you master at this time?
I was.
Yes,
I was.
Master of Magdalen.
And anyway, the outcome was that he then got preferment, as they say in the church, and he was made a canon at Windsor. And surprisingly, I then get a letter from him saying, well, actually, that address you gave was actually quite interesting. Would you like to come and give it to our theology students in Windsor Castle? So I thought, yes, that would be interesting. So I went along, and he was very supportive. And we disagree. I mean, we disagree on a number of things, but nevertheless, he's eminently sensible and says, well, you make your point, and so I've been doing this for a while, and these are priests in service who are going for sort of revision classes, as it were, sent by the bishop, and so I go along and I talk about this same theme. What can we do to relieve suffering, and to what extent are those things that we can do contrary to what a Christian or religious person would think? And then at the end, I said, well, I've spent the morning talking to you, very interesting, but now I'd like you to vote on these issues. So I put up questions for them and asked them to vote. And the first time round, most of them voted against the line that I was taking, but then the chaplain very sensibly said, well, next time we'll have a secret vote, because you don't want the Roman Catholic on your right to see the way you're voting. And so we did it again, and then it actually came out in favour of what I call the scientist view. So I find that very interesting to like doing that, talking to people about to what extent should religion interfere with what many people would think of as reasonable ways of relieving suffering. And the classic case is cystic fibrosis. Should you be able to get rid of all those embryos that are going to have cystic fibrosis by in vitro fertilization, and so essentially avoid an enormous suffering of people suffering from that disease. So that relates in a way to you asked about religion. Well, it touches on that, though it's a kind of a curious activity that happens to have come my way.
Did you find any contradiction, presumably as Master of Magdalen? Is it a master or president?
Yes,
master.
Called master.
You had to preside, or at least preside in chapel and
yes,
so on.
Sort of. Yes.
Did you find any difficulty in doing that as an agnostic? Or?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that an agnostic is an inappropriate position to take. I mean, you could say you're religious or not, but I mean, I basically support what the church does quite strongly, but so I see myself as being sort of practicing Christian, you might say, but the fact that I can't prove what we believe is a good reason to be called agnostic.
Can you disprove what you believe? I mean, those of us, we're flooded with Richard Dawkins nowadays, who you must know.
Yes. He was a student at the same time as me.
And recently there's been a series on Darwin in which he quite forcefully attacks anyone and says science has disproved religion. You know, how can you possibly go on, etc. What do you feel about his views on that?
I did listen to a program of his, and the strength of his argument seems to be relates to evolution, and he says when you take the geological record mainly by collecting samples from ground, it fits in very well. Well, that's not proof that fits well, and I don't think you can disprove religion any more than you can prove it. Seems to me. So he's rather, I think, making a career out of kind of being rather aggressive in this respect, perhaps sometimes rather too aggressive. But that makes you more popular as a television presenter that way.
You knew him, you said.
Yes, he was a graduate student shortly after I was in the same way. He worked under Tinbergen.
What was he like as a person?
Well, he was a very normal sort of graduate student at that time. He hadn't developed this kind of, at least not to my knowledge, this kind of line that he's now taken. But he does he does interest people in science, and that's very good. And I think he balances this kind of idea of what is the word for it? The Americans use it all the time.
Fundamentalism? No.
It's something like that. It means essentially that creationism, I think,
creationism,
is the
yes.
word or used.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me if you can't prove it, you just take the evidence and choose which one you think is most persuasive. But he does a good job in interesting people in science, though I don't actually think that I would agree with his views against religion. He's probably, I think evolution has got a pretty good case for it. So that's what he pushes, and that's good for people to know that. I think.
Coming back to your PhD, what was the central? You said you discovered this new
Well, the
theme.
central theme of that was at that time, this was the 1950s, we did not know whether all cells in the body have the same genes, genome, or not. So the idea was that as an egg turns into an animal with different kinds of cells, maybe the cells lose the genes they don't need anymore. So if your brain cells wouldn't have muscle genes or skin genes, and pancreas gene cells would have lost their brain and muscle gene. That was a perfectly plausible idea, and that would be a fundamental principle of how an egg develops into an organism by losing genes no longer needed except in the germ line. But and the point was to test this by experimental means, and the idea was that you take a cell, a specialized cell, take the nucleus out of that and put it into an egg which has no genes of its own, and if you can produce an individual that way from, shall we say, the nucleus of an intestine cell, then that intestine cell must quite clearly have retained its genes for muscle, bone, brain, and everything else. And that was the key question, which had been, people were aware of the question since the 1890s, but there was no good test for doing it. And then two Americans called Briggs and King discovered that you could in fact transplant the nucleus of a cell into an egg, and they did that very successfully. In that the early the nucleus of early embryo cells did very well. You put it into an egg and it made a good, this was all in frogs, made a tadpole. But when they tested it a bit later, they found that as soon as the embryo developed, these nuclei lost the ability to substitute for the egg and sperm. And so they quite correctly reached the conclusion that perhaps after all genes were being lost or permanently inactivated. And then, so under my supervisor we started work on another frog called Xenopus, and the results were roughly the same, but the key point was they were coming out the other way around, that even when you took the nucleus of a specialized cell, you still managed to get normal development. And we eventually had a paper where we showed you get normal fertile adult animals from the nucleus of an intestine cell, and that really convinced me and a fair number of other people at the time that the opposite conclusion to Briggs and King, namely that the genes are not lost, and therefore hence that all cells of the body have the same genes, same genome as we call it. And that's sort of come back into popularity recently with this whole stem cell field, because the argument is that if all cells have the same genes, then in principle you must be able to create one cell from the nucleus of another cell. So if you take a skin cell or bone marrow cell, you can take its nucleus out, send it through an egg and recreate brain or nerve or anything else, and hence you will get to the idea of what we call patient-specific cell replacement, where if I was lacking functional heart cells, you would say, can we take some of your skin, turn them into heart cells, give you your heart cells back, but of your own genetic constitution, so there's no immunorejection. And that's become very fashionable now, thanks to a Japanese man who discovered a much simpler way of making this transition from adults.
Who was the Japanese?
His name is Yamanaka, and he's become very famous, rightly so. But it's kind of popularized the whole field, so the press is pretty well full of, or has been for a few years, on stem cells, but 10 years ago no one would have known what a stem cell was. So I'm lucky in that the work that we did had a certain fundamental basis to it, of scientific kind, namely that as development occurs, genes are not lost. Fundamental principle, all cells have the same genes. Suddenly that's become potentially valuable and useful to people for the purposes of cell replacement.
How was it that the Americans had come out with the opposite conclusion?
Well, for a good reason, that when they did this experiment with very early embryo cells, it worked. When they took the same cells a day later, it didn't work. And that's true, it just doesn't work very well with that particular species.
Oh, it was the species they were using?
They were using an American frog called Rana pipiens. It's the wild type frog in America. And just for reasons we don't understand, it doesn't work very well there, but luckily for me, it worked rather well with the frog we use, which is a South African one.
When was all this happening? I mean,
this was in the 1950s. So the first successful experiment I was lucky enough to get came in 1958. And then we kept the animals and published what I suppose was the most important paper at that time in this field, and that was the generation of sexually mature normal adult animals from the nucleus of a specialized cell. That was published in the early 1960s.
No, 62 was it?
64, I think, but in that kind of time. Yes.
Was there any ethical or religious opposition to what you were doing at that time? People didn't know?
The first response really was not to believe it. And the two Americans who did this work were highly respected, particularly one of them very highly respected, and an excellent person who I got to know well. And I would have drawn the same conclusion as he did from his experiments, but there was a natural reluctance for some foreign graduate student to challenge these acknowledged masters of and pioneers of the technique as to the interpretation of it. So for quite a few years I was sort of people found all sorts of reasons to say your experiments were wrong. And then gradually over time people concluded that they were right.
Wasn't there some point at which, in fact, your account I read, there was a problem and it didn't work at one stage, and then you redid it and it worked better?
Not really. Our experiments always gave very positive results. The key feature of them was, again, thanks to this wonderful supervisor, he found what we call a genetic marker Now, when you do those experiments, you transplant a nucleus into an egg, and you have to be able to show that the embryo or animal you get back carries the genetic marker of the nucleus you put in, rather than the marker of the egg, whose own nucleus you hoped you'd removed. Because you might not have successfully removed the egg nucleus. It's a sort of slightly haphazard process, and so you really have to have a genetic marker. And thanks to Fishberg, he had discovered one at exactly the right time, and this was of crucial importance for our work. Made it very hard for people to say it's wrong, because the other alternative way didn't have a genetic marker, so if anyone was wrong, it was more likely the other ones were.
I mean, seeing this and doing it technically must have been very, very demanding, and something that only becomes possible with very good equipment. Were there developments in technology?
Not really. The frog cells are very big, and so you can do this by very primitive methods. We made most of our own equipment to make the pipettes or needles you use, and some of them I still use now, some of these things, and it became more refined. And when the work was transferred to mammals, which took a long time to do, they used more sophisticated means of doing everything. But it actually was not very technically demanding. It was the major problem actually was that the egg was almost completely impenetrable, with a very elastic membrane that meant you put a needle in it like you would here, and the needle wouldn't. It would just push the membrane through the other side, so you actually never got it in.
Yeah.
But and thanks to my supervisor having bought a new microscope with an ultraviolet source, it turned out that the ultraviolet light permeabilized the membrane. Piece of good luck. So that solved that problem.
You've done all this when you were very young. I mean, you were only in your 20s still.
Yes.
And you were already the subject of discussion and so on. You were still at Oxford at this stage?
Yes, I stayed there for quite a long time, gradually moving along the academic scale until I was about 39 years old.
What was your first official appointment after you were a graduate student?
I then became a research fellow at a college, at my college, Christchurch. They appointed me to a junior research sort of lectureship, like a research place.
Yeah.
And then they promoted me to a sort of more senior research post, which I retained for the whole of the time I was there very kindly. That was a very good position. Didn't have much teaching to do, and it was a very favoured position.
Have you done much teaching since, or?
When I then became officially a member of the teaching staff of the Department of Zoology, so I did do teaching, but not a great deal. I remember that the professor who took over, Alistair Hardy, came from Cambridge actually, a man called John Pringle from here, and he appointed me and said he would like me to start off my job with 24 lectures straight off, and that was very tough. And then the next year he said, well, actually I think we can do with 16. And after a few years later he said, well, actually 8 is enough. By the time I left, I was down to about 4. So I was lucky.
That was no reflection of your lecturing ability.
Probably wasn't, because I attracted a lot of graduate students, but nevertheless, I was grateful for being relieved of it.
Did you like lecturing or enjoy it?
Don't really like undergraduate teaching, no. I never, even in Cambridge when I did some, I didn't really like it very much. It was very, I objected in principle to the idea that the students, as you know, fill in a report form, and they can say whatever they want, however rude they want to be, which luckily I was spared the rudest ones, but the worst and very offensive ones, and they don't sign it. They just say sort of sack Dr. X.
Do they? No, they don't do that in my subject.
Do they not?
No.
They should sign them. If they want, they're entitled to a view, that's very good, but they should be prepared to say, this is my view and that's my thing, that's fine.
Well, they did this for lectures. We have a kind of comments on the lectures, but not on supervisions.
Oh no, well this was lectures I'm
lectures.
talking about.
Oh yes. Oh yes. They usually said my hair was not brushed enough or something,
that's
too
very
brushed.
mild compared to what else.
But you, by implication, you enjoyed PhD and postgraduate.
Yes, that was a nice
teaching.
time. PhD was a lovely time. Nice people and a wonderful supervisor and very pleasant, lovely department and that sort of thing. And then I went for a postdoc period to California. Again, thanks to the good advice of my supervisor.
What was that like?
I went to Caltech, which was a very good place, and I
Mm.
got to know a whole lot of the senior professors who there's only about one of them left now, who I saw a few months ago, but one got to know them all. It was an excellent place to be. But the work I did, I never could make it work. I worked on bacteriophage genetics and I couldn't make them work. So as soon as I'd done that, I went back to embryology. But with a much, having learnt a great deal.
This was the time that Fred Sanger was working on phages, was it, as well?
He was, well, I suppose he was working on phages. I mean, of course, his real contribution was sequencing rather than phages. But,
sequencing a phage.
There were eminent people there at Caltech who I got to know, but I just said that kind of science didn't suit me at all, so happy to get up.
Did that kind of society suit you? I mean, have you ever been tempted to go and teach or research in America?
Well, I was I didn't have a job when I finished my postdoc period, so I was sent round, and I remember the occasion when I went to, there was an assistant professorship available at Columbia University, so I was interviewed for that, and the head of the department said, well, Dr. Gurdon, I'm sorry to say we don't feel we can offer you this assistant professorship, but he said, I would say one thing, when you go back to Caltech, will you tell your supervisor at Caltech, who was only about 2 years older than me, that any time he lifts the phone, we have a full professorship we'd be delighted to give him. So it was about as thumbs down as you can get.
Exactly. But subsequently, over the years, you must have been given tempting offers to go to America.
Yes, up to a point. No, not enormously. I think one that was tempting was a job at Stanford, which I would have, if I'd been unable to get a job in this country, which I would have liked, I would have been glad to have gone. I like Stanford a lot, to have gone there, but you know, I've been lucky. I had good jobs in this country, and people make sort of vague inquiries, or have done vague inquiries, but unless you show some interest, they don't really pursue it very much. So.
After, I mean, you got up to the level of a sort of university lectureship at Oxford, and then what happened?
Well, then I got this letter from Max Perutz.
Ah, yes.
Almost, you might say, out of the blue. Just saying that they had an appointment and would I by any chance be interested in moving to the MRC Molecular Biology Lab in Cambridge, and that was of course the ultra famous lab, as you can imagine, with a kind of spectacular collection of people, so it was an enormously attractive career move for someone who hadn't really learnt any molecular biology, so I kind of came across and talked to him and others, and Max was a wonderful person, very supportive, and so he in the end said, yes, well, we decided to offer you the job. And it was a whole set of rooms, and the Oxford people had been good to me, and they got me an offer of an MRC unit, which is quite a significant amount of research support with, say, 4 or 5 positions. But the head of the department was unable to give me a space where I could have a coherent group. So it was tempting, partly for that reason, to move to, and of course of the eminence of this Cambridge lab, to come here. So I accepted the job, and then other people in Oxford, heads of other departments, who I got to know personally very well, most notably a person called Rodney Porter, who was a wonderful man, got a Nobel Prize for immunology. He had a biochemistry, but I knew him personally well, or got to know him, and I never really did know my head of department very well. So he then mounted a kind of a sort of counter move to say, perhaps after all you shouldn't move and we'll see what we can do. But the head of department, my head of department stuck to his guns, as he had a right to do, and said, so, well, this is what I'm offering, take it or leave it. So, but the end result of Rodney Porter's activities, well, I wrote to Max and said, well, I'm afraid after all, it really is rather difficult. We have a new house in Oxford, our family in Oxford, so on balance it really wouldn't be very sensible to move. And instead of Max, he could have written back and said, well, you've wasted a lot of my time, but damn you, I wish you hadn't. But you got this charming letter saying, oh, well, it's been a pleasure to meet you, you know, really, if you ever change your mind, do just let me know, but in any case, if we've done something to help you where you are, we're so pleased. What an amazing
Sweet.
letter. Of quite amazing, I thought. So anyway, the outcome was that when this failed, I then wrote to Max and said, well, after all, actually, I would really rather like to move. You know, so he again said, well, come along and talk about it, and so that happened. I actually then accepted the job and moved into Max's Institute, and that was a wonderful place to be. And again, I got to know him very well. Enormous respect for Max.
What sort of person was he? I mean, can you paint a
yes,
picture
he was
of
an
him?
amazing person. He was very mild in character, and a good example was that as head of this, it must be the most successful research lab in history, I would say. I think they've now had 15 Nobel Prizes or something. That's quite extraordinary. Anyway, he didn't act, he wasn't a director, he was chairman, and he specialized, he would insist on that. So when you wanted to ask your ultimate director or something, you just wait till he was in the coffee queue and say, oh, by the way, I really would like a fraction collector or something, do you think we could do that? And he'd just say, okay, just go and get it. And you didn't make appointments with his secretary, you would just wait till you saw him. Extremely low-key kind of administration. And I think that's why he was able to keep this amazing group of people, when you think about it. I mean, Fred Sanger, Francis Crick, Cesar Milstein, Aaron Klug, I mean, one after another, they were all kept in his institute for their whole working life, whereas any one of them could have taken an enormously prestigious job anywhere else in the world. But Max somehow kept the whole lot going, and I've never quite understood how he did it, but he did have this extremely mild way of doing things. It was never the director says. It was just, well, tell me what you think and see what we can do. So I attribute that to as a real lesson. And when we, in due course of time, came to start our own institute, we sort of set ourselves up with a chairman, not a director, to sort of try and emulate Max's style.
I think it was from Aaron that I heard he used to, in the aforesaid coffee room or elsewhere, used to just wander around and talk to graduate students.
Absolutely.
And assistant staff and
yes.
ordinary people.
That's right. He
made
did.
them feel part of.
Yeah, that's right. That was one of his great things. He'd just come and sit at your table, and at first you thought, what on earth do we say to this ultra eminent person? But in a way, you got to know him eventually, and it was his style. It was quite remarkable, I think.
And I also heard that he was very trusting. I mean, he told, I think, Aaron Klug that after Aaron had got his Nobel Prize, that he hadn't thought that what he was doing was at all possible.
Right.
But he hadn't said anything. He just trusted him to get on with it.
Yes. It's a lovely story that goes in that connection with, I forget whether it was Max told me this or not, but apparently at an early stage the MRC said to Max, I see you have all these people on this list. I see there's a person called Klug. What's that person doing? I see they haven't published anything for 5 years. And Max said, oh yes, that's all right, he's still thinking.
Well, there are one or two of the others who it would be nice to have a pen portrait of too. Unfortunately, I never had a chance to talk to Cesar Milstein. What was he like?
Wonderful person. Again, I knew him because I was a very keen ice skater, and we used to go out to the fens, and I would take Max Barutz and Cesar skating, so I got to know him well. And well, he's what can one say? He's a brilliant person. Very. I find all these eminent people extremely pleasant and interesting, and yeah. What can one say?
Just brilliant.
Yes, yes.
But I have had a chance to interview Aaron Klug, and
Yes.
he was talking about his recent work, and I wondered whether you'd come across this zinc finger work.
Yes, I have.
He seems to think it's got a large potential.
Yes, well, we've been sort of doing a bit on the side through Aaron with him and with the company he works with, Sangamo. So that hasn't actually worked out in the way we hoped it would. It just doesn't seem to work the way we thought it would, so we've rather discontinued that. But Aaron has this phenomenal memory, you may know. It's quite embarrassing.
Hmm.
I mean, he's likely to some point say to me, out of the blue, he'd say, you know, that paper you published in 1962, you said something, and I can't remember what I said, but and he remembers things like that. I don't know how.
Photographic memory.
Yeah, staggering memory. Yes, yes.
And Fred Sanger,
well,
I interviewed him, and he seemed very gentle.
Here he is, extremely so. Yes, I wrote a thing which was quite amusing. They asked me to write a kind of slightly biographical opening chapter in the annual review of Cell and Developmental Biology, and so I wrote about these various people there. And Fred Sanger, I remember saying that if you met him, if you came to the Institute without knowing who he was, you would undoubtedly take him as a janitor, because he was extremely low-key and sort of, you know, you'd ask him a question, he'd look as if he couldn't understand the question because he was thinking of a cleverer answer to it. But very nice man, and he used to, I mean, I befriended him a bit when we went to MRT. He would invite us to join his research group. We mostly weren't invited to join the kind of cell biology one, but Fred's was a different one. So it warmed to him enormously. So
Completely the opposite of another Kingsman, Sidney Brenner.
Yes.
All fireworks and
yes, very different.
Brilliant. Is there anything to say about Sidney?
Well, he was undoubtedly too clever for me. So when I would talk to him, I could mostly not understand what he was saying. So and that I concluded that was because he would jump. I think in a very slow sort of step-by-step process, he will jump from here to there, and I couldn't follow that at all. So that I have to say, I don't think I ever really communicated very closely with him. Probably about the only one I really didn't.
What about Francis?
Yes, well, he was a member of Churchill College, which I was too, and so immense admiration for his mind, the way he could, some impossibly complicated thing, he would tell you what the main point of it was. So I liked him and admired him. The people I wouldn't say I knew him socially anything like as well as Max Perutz. So curious enough, the people that I knew socially and hence in a way scientifically were the ones that really weren't particularly close to my own field. So Sidney would have been nearer to me than most other people, but I hardly ever had any scientific conversations with him. Fred Sanger, Cesar Milstein, Hugh Huxley I knew very well. These people, rather outside my field, were the ones I happened to have warmed to.
You know John Walker?
Yes.
I interviewed him.
Yes, well, he's, of course, yes.
Yeah, he was there too.
Yes.
I mean, apart from Max's personality, do you have any other clues as to why this was, if you're right, the most successful science laboratory in history?
I don't think I really do. I mean, when you think about it, the people like Sidney and Francis Crick had to share an office for the whole of their time. It's quite ridiculous, really. And then everyone had minimal space. But I suspect it was that the concept of a chairman can be more effective than a director. And it's hard to do when an institute becomes big. That's very difficult to do. You sort of have to have a group of people who really govern the place. But in some extraordinary way, Max did it in a way that displeased no one, as far as I can see. Well, I mean, minor, trivial irritations, but nothing compared to what he achieved. So I don't really know how he achieved that.
Where was it out in its present building at Addenbrooke's, or?
It was when I joined it, yes.
Because it's quite a way out of Cambridge, isn't it?
That's right.
Which means that it's separated off from the colleges.
Yes, that's right.
And it means that the people there wouldn't necessarily go in and take a major part in college life.
No, that's true.
It would be, I mean, people often say that one of the strengths of Cambridge is the college system.
Yes.
And bringing people from different disciplines together. But sitting out in the new Addenbrooke's site, you'd be slightly divorced from college life.
We were. That's true. Max had a college fellowship, and so did Aaron, and Sidney was at King's, and Francis was at Churchill. But it was Richard Keynes who was good enough to arrange for me to be a fellow at Churchill. That made a big difference. So I had a college connection, because I rather lacked it coming from Oxford, where I had a strong college connection. and then Richard Keynes really engineered that.
Mm.
So I became a research fellow at Churchill for a long time, like 20 years, and that was a huge benefit, which I've always appreciated. I really thank him for that. It wasn't Francis Crick who could have proposed it, it was actually Richard Keynes.
No, I've interviewed him as well.
Yes, I'm sure.
Did you go into college much?
Yes, I hardly ever for lunch. In fact, I never really lunch in colleges anyway. So dinners I find very pleasant, and it's a wonderful kind of interesting community that you can take a guest to, and it's always interesting. So I really, I feel slightly parasitic, to be truthful, because I don't think I do enough to help the college system, but I really appreciate it a great deal. And my Christchurch days were very different there. I remember if you went to High Table at Christchurch and anything scientific or technological was inappropriate conversation.
Was it?
You should not be allowed to. That's not. You do not talk about that at dinner. Whereas now, I would say most conversations in the colleges I'm involved with, is more often than not, has some scientific or technical, because it's interesting. So it's a big change.
It is. Or is it a change between Oxford and Cambridge?
No, I don't think so, really. I think it's the change in the... I
mean, when you first went to Churchill and so on, could you talk about anything?
Yes,
of course, it was
a
college that was set up for scientists.
It was, and there was a sort of interest in science. Yes, that's right. Yes.
I mean, there was a taboo in many colleges for a long time about talking about your own subject, your own...
You mean that you shouldn't?
Yeah, you shouldn't talk about it with a fellow person in your discipline.
Well, I think there's an element now of, in order to make it a nice social occasion, it isn't much good to talk to an immediate colleague just about what you're doing. But
yes,
you would usually, if there's someone nearby, you'd say, we're talking about stem cells or about ethics or something, and you sort of bring them in.
Yeah.
I think that's a socially desirable thing to do, and I would say we still make an effort to do that, even though, as often as not, you're talking about something remotely scientific or technological.
Did you ever feel or have any conversations which were important in your work? I mean, Gabriel describes how he first met Pat, or Pat met Gabriel at dinner in King's, and then they worked together closely for a long period.
Yes.
Was it important in any...
Well, these occasions, which have not really, they haven't remained in my mind, shall we say, as important events. One always does gain. Every time I go to college, I find I pick up something I didn't know about, usually not in my immediate field, but a sort of relevance to something else, which is very interesting.
How did you then switch from, or add on, shall we say, Magdalene as well as...
Right, that came out of the blue. I got a letter from a person not known to me, saying that it, as I would know, which I didn't, it was his job to appoint the mastership of Magdalene College, and he would value an opportunity to discuss this matter with me, which I took to mean that he had some candidates who he thought I knew the background or the lowdown, so I was invited out to Lord Braybrooke's
this is, yes, Audley End, isn't it?
Audley End, yes, very pleasant. We had a very nice lunch, talking about everything from trains to skiing to holidays, and then suddenly he said, I thought, well, no, who is it here? Who is he after? He wants me to contain something. And then he suddenly said, well, now, yes, back to business. Now, what about it? So I said, how do you mean, what about what? He said, are you interested in the masterships? I said, well, I haven't even considered the matter. I mean, how can't just kind of say yes or no just like that. So we sort of agreed. I said, well, I can't, you can't say you want me to do it, or I can't say, we need to think about it more and discuss it and reflect and talk to my colleagues and so on. So I said, well, could we agree that we think about it a bit more? So we went on like that, and then had a few more conversations, and then Magdalene asked me to go along there and be interviewed in an extremely mild and non-invasive way. My goodness, compared to what you hear on in other colleges, I should think yours must be
pretty tough, yes.
Pretty useless business. There couldn't have been more benign. I mean, it was really unbelievably so. So in the course of time, then I was in the lab, I got a call from Lord Braybrooke saying, well, will you do the job? So by that time we thought it would be indeed nice to do it if I didn't have to give up my lab, which they said I didn't have to do.
When you say we, you
Well, they're interested in my wife too. Which
yes,
is very
I was going to
sensible,
ask
so
about your marriage.
Yes,
When-
they asked her to come along too. That was very wise. She made a huge contribution to college, much more than I was able to do actually, and was very much appreciated for that.
Mm.
She really gave her whole time to managing the
What
college.
is her background?
She has no. She did a little bit of nursing and then secretarial work, and otherwise been a really extremely supportive wife, kind of looking after the children when I.
How many children have you got?
2.
Mm.
But I mean, I was working extremely hard in my mid-career, long hours and weekends and evenings and things. So I was very lucky to have someone who could put up with that and keep the kind of domestic side running.
Mm. What is her name?
Her first name is Jean.
Jean.